Darkness fell over the prison like a shroud of finality. A thick silence blanketed the cell block, broken only by the sound of distant keys jingling and the occasional low murmur of guards changing shifts. Behind reinforced concrete walls and steel bars, Benjamin Ritchie was living his final hours. The countdown had begun. It was just past 12 a.m. when the warden delivered the official notification. The execution is scheduled for 6 more p.m. today. Ritchie nodded slowly. No tears, no outburst, just a cold acceptance, like a man who had rehearsed this moment for years. For him, time no longer moved forward. It collapsed inward. Every second carried the weight of his past, his crime, and the irreversible consequences that now stalked him like a shadow. The prison, known for housing some of the most dangerous men in America, seemed unusually still. Even the other inmates, separated by thick concrete and locked behind solid metal doors, fell into a haunted silence. They knew what was coming. A life was ending. And not just any life. A man they'd lived next to, talked to through vents, shouted at during lockdowns. Tonight, he would die. Ritchie's final 24 hours were controlled to the second. He was removed from his regular cell and placed in the Death Watch unit, a special holding cell just a few feet from the execution chamber. The lighting was brighter, the surveillance tighter, and the silence louder. Guards were posted outside his cell 24/7. Every word he spoke, every move he made, was monitored and recorded. Inside his cell, there was only a small metal cot, a steel toilet sink combo, and a tiny writing desk. No books, no radio, no window. Just 4 claustrophobic walls, closing in with every passing hour. Benjamin lay down, but didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, blinking in rhythm with the security light above. He knew that his next sleep would be eternal. Outside, the world kept spinning. Cars rushed down freeways, children played in parks, families laughed over dinner. But inside that concrete fortress, time slowed to a crawl. The execution team had already begun preparations. The IV tubing was tested. The chemicals were checked. The clock was ticking louder now. A chaplain visited him in the early morning. Their conversation was brief. No confessions, no tears, just a few nods, maybe a silent prayer. Benjamin had made peace with whatever he believed in. Or perhaps he believed in nothing at all. The guards brought him his final uniform, a plain white jumpsuit, starched and stiff. As he slipped it on, his hands trembled for just a moment. Not out of fear, but out of realization. This was it. By the time the sun rose, Benjamin Ritchie was no longer living in days or hours. He was living in minutes. Long before the death sentence and the concrete cell, Benjamin Ritchie was just another boy in a quiet American neighborhood. Born in the early 1980s, in a mid-sized town tucked somewhere between cornfields and factories, Benjamin didn't seem destined for the darkness. His childhood home had peeling paint and a broken mailbox, but inside, it held the warmth of a struggling but close-knit family. His mother, a waitress who worked double shifts, often said Benjamin had the gentlest heart of all her children. As a young boy, he was quiet, liked drawing, and never got into serious trouble. At least not in the beginning. His father, though, was a different story. An alcoholic with a quick temper, he ruled the household with fists instead of words. Benjamin learned early on that silence kept him safe. By the time he was 12, Benjamin had already seen more violence inside his home than many soldiers see in war. His teenage years became a blur of suspensions, petty theft, and fights that always ended with blood. He started skipping school, then dropped out completely. By 17, he was on probation. At 18, he was in jail. The transformation was slow but steady, a wounded child turning into a dangerous adult. Friends from his past described him as a ticking time bomb. Others said he was just trying to survive in a world that never gave him a chance. But the truth, like most human stories, was far more complicated. He bounced between low-paying jobs and short stints in jail. Drugs came into the picture. So did guns. And then came a relationship that would tear him apart. A toxic, violent romance that ended with restraining orders and a shattered sense of self-worth. He started carrying a gun just in case, and his paranoia grew by the week. By the time he turned 30, Benjamin was no longer the boy who sketched cartoon characters in his notebook. He was restless, angry, and spiraling. In his own words, later recorded in a prison interview, he said, "I wasn't thinking about right or wrong anymore. I just wanted the noise in my head to stop." People who once knew him say there were signs. He was unraveling in plain sight, but no one stepped in. Or maybe no one believed he was capable of what he would eventually do. What happened next wasn't just a tragedy. It was the moment Benjamin Ritchie crossed a line he could never return from. And it all began with a knock at someone's door, a knock that would end in blood. It was supposed to be just another night, quiet streets, porch lights glowing in the dark, families winding down. But somewhere in that calm, something unspeakable was about to happen. The victim was a 29-year-old man named Lucas Grant, a local school teacher known for his kindness and soft-spoken nature. He lived alone in a modest duplex just outside the city, the kind of place where no one locked their doors and neighbors still waved at each other from across the lawn. At 9:13 p.m., neighbors heard a knock on Lucas's door. Minutes later, they heard shouting. Then, 3 gunshots. A pause. Then one more. When police arrived just 12 minutes later, the scene inside was pure horror. Lucas was found lying face down in the hallway, shot once in the chest, twice in the abdomen, and once execution-style in the head. Blood smeared the walls. The air reeked of gunpowder and death. But the question that chilled everyone: why? Witnesses quickly identified the shooter as Benjamin Ritchie, a former friend of the victim. The two had once worked together at a hardware store and had fallen out over a debt and alleged threats made months prior. There were also whispers of jealousy. A woman both men had dated. Whatever the motive, the murder wasn't random. It was personal. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Benjamin filling up his car just 30 minutes before the murder. He wore a black hoodie, jeans, and gloves. The cashier would later say he seemed calm. Too calm. Police arrested him just 3 hours after the crime. He didn't resist. In fact, Benjamin said only one thing to the arresting officer: "I did what I had to do." The murder weapon, a .45 caliber handgun, was found in a storm drain just 2 blocks from Lucas's home. Ballistics confirmed the match. Blood under Benjamin's fingernails sealed it. The case was airtight. But the most chilling part wasn't the evidence. It was what Benjamin did after the killing. Before tossing the gun, he went to a local diner and sat at the counter for 20 minutes. He ordered black coffee and pancakes. When the waitress smiled and asked how his night was going, he simply said, "Just needed to clear my head." That detail stunned everyone during the trial. Prosecutors called it a cold, calculated moment of composure after an act of pure evil. They argued that Benjamin didn't snap. He planned it. He meant every pull of the trigger. And when he walked away, he felt nothing. The public was outraged. News anchors called it one of the most brutal killings the county had seen in decades. The community mourned Lucas Grant, a man who had done nothing but try to help a friend. But Benjamin Ritchie's name would be remembered for something else, not just for murder, but for the eerie stillness that followed it. The kind of stillness that made you wonder, was the monster always there? The courtroom was packed. Families, reporters, neighbors, all squeezed into wooden benches, waiting to see the man accused of a brutal, cold-blooded execution. As Benjamin Ritchie entered in shackles, escorted by deputies, the room fell into a thick, uncomfortable silence. His face was blank. No expression, no flicker of remorse, just cold eyes scanning the crowd, like he was already somewhere else. The prosecution didn't waste time. They opened with a photo of Lucas Grant's lifeless body, face down in his own hallway. The gasps were audible. A mother clutched her chest. A man began to cry. The district attorney leaned in toward the jury and delivered a single line that echoed through the room. This was not a crime of passion. This was an execution. Witnesses were called. One by one, they described Benjamin as distant, paranoid, even threatening in the weeks leading up to the murder. A former co-worker testified that Benjamin once said, "Some people just deserve to be wiped out." The defense tried to paint a different picture, a man mentally unraveling, pushed to the edge by trauma, addiction, and years of untreated PTSD. They argued that Benjamin didn't go to that house to kill. He went for closure, and something inside him snapped. But the evidence was merciless. Ballistics, surveillance footage, text messages sent minutes before the shooting. And perhaps most damning, the diner waitress, who took the stand and told the jury he was calm, like he hadn't just killed someone, he even left a tip. By the third day of trial, the outcome felt inevitable. Jurors couldn't meet Benjamin's gaze anymore. Even his own attorney avoided looking him in the eye. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, there was no reaction, no tears, no protest, just silence. Then came the sentencing phase. The prosecution demanded the death penalty, citing the cruelty, the planning, and the utter lack of remorse. The defense pleaded for life without parole. But the jury didn't waver. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with the sentence, death by lethal injection. As the judge read the final words, Benjamin blinked slowly and nodded, not in protest, not in fear, almost like he expected this ending all along. And maybe, deep down, he did. 15 years. That's how long Benjamin Ritchie sat on death row, waiting, thinking, and counting every second between life and death. He entered the prison as a man already sentenced to die, but the system doesn't move fast when it comes to execution. Paperwork, appeals, clemency hearings, justice crawls on death row. His world shrank to a 6-by-9-foot concrete box, locked behind a solid steel door. No contact with other inmates, no TV, no radio, just a single bed, a toilet, and a small metal desk. Light buzzed from above, day and night, and silence became a part of his bloodstream. Each morning began the same, the clank of the food slot opening, a tray sliding through. Sometimes it was eggs, sometimes it was cold oatmeal, no choices, no complaints, just routine. For the first few years, Benjamin wrote letters, dozens of them, to his mother, to reporters, to legal aid, even one to the victim's family. In one haunting line, he wrote, "There's no day that passes where I don't remember the sound of that last gunshot." But he never asked for forgiveness. Over time, the letters slowed. The appeals started piling up and then started getting denied. One by one, every chance at overturning his death sentence vanished. State courts, federal courts, the Supreme Court. Nothing worked. He kept a notebook where he marked every execution carried out in the prison during those 15 years. Names, dates, methods. He never said why, but when a guard once asked him, Benjamin replied, "I want to know when they're getting closer to mine." Some guards called him polite. Others called him cold. He never caused problems. He didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't break things. He simply existed. "He was the quietest inmate I ever watched," one guard later said. Too quiet. He didn't find religion, didn't ask for a priest, but he read books. A lot of them. Philosophy, mostly. Notes scribbled in the margins showed a man trying to make sense of what he'd done, or maybe just what he'd become. And then, after 15 long years, it came. A simple notice slipped under the cell door. Execution date confirmed. That night, Benjamin didn't cry, he didn't scream. He simply tore out a page from one of his books, wrote 5 words, and folded it shut. The words, "It ends," as it should. It's a ritual both haunting and oddly human, the final meal. A prisoner's last request, a strange act of mercy before the state takes a life. And when the time came for Benjamin Ritchie to choose his, the prison staff waited with anticipation. Would it be a feast, something symbolic, or nothing at all? His choice surprised everyone. He asked for fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cornbread, a slice of pecan pie, and a cold Dr. Pepper. No lobster, no steak, no exotic request. Just the kind of meal you'd expect at a Southern family dinner table. Simple, comforting, nostalgic. The prison kitchen prepared the food fresh, as is tradition. The tray was laid out neatly. Nothing touching, everything warm. At exactly 4:12 p.m., 2 guards entered his cell. One carried the meal, the other watched his every move. Benjamin sat on the edge of his metal cot and stared at the tray for a moment, as if it triggered something, a memory, maybe a face. Then, without a word, he picked up the fork. He ate slowly, deliberately, not like a man rushing through his final meal, but like someone savoring every bite for what it was, his last experience of flavor, of warmth, of anything resembling life before death. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. He left the cornbread untouched, and when a guard gently asked, "Was everything all right?" Benjamin simply nodded and whispered, "Tastes like home." That's all he said. Final meals often tell us something about a person, their regrets, their roots, their last grasp at meaning. For Benjamin Ritchie, maybe it was a reminder of a simpler time, a memory buried under the weight of his crime. Or maybe it was just food, one last comfort before the cold steel of the execution table. At 4:48 p.m., the tray was collected. The food was gone. The moment had passed. Next would come the walk, and the final words. At exactly 5:52 p.m., the heavy door of Benjamin Ritchie's death watch cell creaked open. 2 correctional officers stepped inside. One held a clipboard, the other a set of restraints. "Time," the officer said. Benjamin stood up slowly. He didn't speak. No resistance. Just a faint exhale, like he'd been holding his breath for 15 years. They handcuffed him, chained his ankles, and led him down the narrow hallway toward the execution chamber. The corridor was deathly silent. Every step echoed off the walls like a drumbeat of finality. Guards didn't look him in the eyes. No one said a word, just the sound of footsteps and the weight of inevitability. Witnesses had already taken their seats behind the glass. On one side, the victim's family, pale, trembling, bracing for closure or maybe just more pain. On the other, a few reporters, a prison chaplain, and a state-appointed spiritual advisor. No family came for Benjamin, no friends, no one. He was strapped to the gurney at 5:58 p.m. Thick leather belts wrapped around his wrists, chest, and legs. 2 IVs were inserted, one in each arm. The execution protocol was methodical, cold, practiced like a science. A microphone dangled above him from the ceiling, crackling to life. The warden leaned in and asked, "Do you have any final words?" Benjamin looked straight up at the ceiling, not at the witnesses, not at the guards. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his voice came out, low, cracked, but steady. "I'm sorry, not just for what I did, but for who I became. I was lost long before that night. I can't ask you to forgive me. I wouldn't, but I hope somehow this brings peace." He paused, then added one final line. "Tell my mother I remember the song she used to hum when I was scared. I hear it now." Gasps came from the witness room. A reporter lowered her pen. A guard blinked hard, jaw clenched. But Benjamin, he didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He just closed his eyes. The microphone cut out. The time was 6:02 p.m., and in that frozen moment, time stood still. Not for justice, not for vengeance, but for the last breath of a man who walked himself into death, with a lullaby in his head. The moment had arrived. At exactly 6:03 p.m., with Benjamin Ritchie lying motionless on the gurney, the signal was given. Behind a small window in a separate chamber, an unseen executioner opened the valve. A clear liquid began to flow, first a sedative, followed by a paralytic, and finally the agent that would stop his heart. Inside the viewing room, silence gripped every witness. Benjamin's chest rose slowly, then again, and again, until it didn't. At 6:10 p.m., his lips parted slightly, his eyes remained shut. His hands, strapped tightly to the armrests, didn't twitch. By 6:13 p.m., the prison doctor approached, placed 2 fingers on his neck, then checked the heart monitor. He looked at the warden, gave a small nod. Time of death, 6:14 p.m. And just like that, it was over. 15 years after the crime, dozens of appeals, one last meal, one final breath. Benjamin Ritchie was gone, but death didn't erase the pain he left behind. On one side of the glass, Lucas Grant's mother broke down in tears. She clutched a photo of her son, the same picture shown in court all those years ago, smiling, young, full of life. For her, this was not vengeance. It was survival. "He took everything from us," she told reporters afterward. "We didn't watch him die for closure. We watched because we needed to believe justice still exists." Others questioned that justice. Outside the prison gates, a small group of protesters stood quietly with signs. "Executions are not healing. Killing is still killing." They didn't cry for Benjamin Ritchie, but they questioned whether death could ever bring peace. The news outlets ran headlines within the hour. "Executed. Benjamin Ritchie, 15 years after brutal killing." Some told the story as fact, others leaned into emotion. But the truth didn't change. One man was dead, another had been executed, and a hole still remained. Inside the prison, Benjamin's body was removed from the chamber and placed into a plain pine coffin. No funeral, no family present. His remains were cremated as requested. He left no estate, no final will, just a folded note found under his mattress that read, "Let it end with me." The guards said the cell felt colder that night, empty, yet still carrying something heavy, like the walls themselves had absorbed the story. And as the prison lights flickered off one by one, Benjamin Ritchie's name faded into the long, dark ledger of American death row history. Another file closed, another ghost sealed behind concrete and silence.